So for our first talk after tea, we have Professor Peter Taylor, who's joining us from the ARU in Clarence. Is that the right one, Peter? Cool. So without further ado, welcome, Peter.
So, thanks everybody. It's really great to be here, and thanks Rob for inviting me. I'm going to give a bit of a rodent's eye perspective of bush encroachment based on botanical and zoological, matched botanical and zoological archives we have that we can look back 100 years. And I'm going to focus here in Soutpansberg. This is a photograph taken in the Buzzard Mountain in Southveld grassland on top of the mountain, which hasn't been encroached. But the interesting thing is that these slopes all below have been completely encroached over the last 100 years through the work of Norbert Hahn, who I'm going to touch on his work, which nicely frames my work. Norbert was my postdoc for a while I was working in the University of Venda, where we did this research. It's been published. So I'm going to focus on two species, a winner, a global change winner, a savanna species, Optimus angoniensis, and a global change loser, a grassland species. And I hope it will make sense when I go on. Let's see, this did work. I know these are very simplistic models of potential niche of biomes. In general, they predict that the grassland niche may contract at the expense of savanna. So we sort of superimposed these models onto maxent models for rodents as well. The two rodents fit very closely to the two biomes. They fit like hand and glove, the savanna species and the grassland species. These are historical museum records. And the nice thing how we can use these as sentinels of climate change are that we have records from 50 to 100 years ago where we have expeditions that collected small mammals in the Soutpansberg and then reflect on the edge between the two biomes where we might expect to find changes. So, pointing the wrong way. Very generally, okay, there's the winner, the savanna species. That's its museum records, and that's its, again, that's the current niche, and that's the future niche. So, increasing upslope, as we might expect from the potential niche of grasslands in future, and the exact opposite. So this just looks like a plot of the grassland biome, but those are museum records of flay rats, the grassland species. The current distribution already shows that some of these are outliers, some of these grassland. And the future shows quite a strong contraction in the niche. So we can then go back and look at these places and see how things might have changed. The important thing as well is the drivers of these two maxent models, and I'm glad Pete LaRue gave you all the methods of that, so I don't have to go into it. But the main driver, if you like, explaining the distribution, the predicted distributions of the flay rat, Optimus auratus from grassland, is an inverse relationship with temperature. So they're like cooler temperatures. Whereas the Angoni flay rat, the savanna species, is mostly driven by a preference for wetter climate. So we also, thanks to the study of Richard Marcy David in 1973, his PhD thesis, he trapped on a grid for 3 years, 59 trapping nights at Rietvlei, which is this wetland in the middle of Pretoria. And on the same grid, so on the left and right, you see the same grid, 10 by 10 grid, and the trap captures of the grassland species on the left, in hatched, and then the savanna species on the right. So here was a place where both species occur. There's microhabitat segregation, and he also showed very clear associations. So the flay rat, the grassland species, occurred on moister soils close to this flay, more lush vegetation, higher canopy cover, and up at drier soils in the case of Optimus angoniensis. So we were able to revisit this 40 years after his study. You can see he caught predominantly the flay rat, the grassland species, but both species, and we also caught both species. An order of magnitude fewer flay rats, but I'm not sure. We didn't calculate density, so I'm not sure if it's trapping bias. But these species also differ in their color. So the grassland species are darker. It's more concealed. It doesn't need to avoid predation to the extent that the Angoni flay rat does in drier habitats. It needs to be more cryptic, to possibly due to predation. So we know quite a bit about the biology and the micro habitat of these species and expectations of climate change. Things get really interesting in the Zoutpansberg. So this just shows you in green the occurrence of the grassland biome, which is the Zoutpansberg summit grasslands, and they are still there, and they have not been encroached. But as I said, what Norbert Hahn showed was in the Zoutpansberg, the colored areas represent predicted models of the distribution of the extinct grasslands that occurred on the basalt-derived soils. Depending on N values, which I won't go into in detail, but he also corroborated this with, and I'm just showing you the green to show this is not those summit grasslands. This is now classified as Zoutpansberg Mountain Thicket, so it's been totally encroached. You can see that clearly. It's acacia, I can say acacia, a taxacantha that I think is one of the main dominant species of encroachers. So, yeah, there are many archival photographs that Norbert Hahn presented in his paper for different sites going back to 1888. And not only bush encroachment, but afforestation has been a huge effect in the Zoutpansberg. These are a really nice series of pictures from Louis Trichardt, where I lived when I worked at the University of Venda. The town was established in 1888 because it was a big swamp. They had to make the town on that ridge. But they planted in 1920 plantations, and 8 years later, the swamps were gone, and they could increase the town. So that must be a massive factor, afforestation. So we know large mammals were also crucially important, keeping these grasslands open, and this massive orgy of hunting that occurred in turn of the last century extirpated 14 species of large mammals, of which 9 of them were grazers. So it tells us this was an open grazing environment. And of course, I'd have to say more about fire and its suppression that's been probably important in the bush encroachment. The really nice thing is that this is one of Norbert's historical photographs, which shows Newgate Farm, where the end one goes up. It was being built, it used to go left of that mountain, and it's now much there. The site, it was 1904, and then the recent one shows how it's changed. What's nice is that Austin Roberts did his mammal expedition for 3 weeks there in July 1923 at Newgate Farm. So that's an aerial photograph showing where he sampled and where my students sampled a kilometer away 90 years later. It's more recent, that was 50s, and you can see even from the 50s to 2008, a lot of bush encroachment. So what did we find? So Austin Roberts collected mostly the grassland species. Artemis auratus. 6 out of 8 captures, we failed to collect the grassland species, but we didn't only sample. So this was an area that was thought to be previously covered in extinct grasslands. So we also sampled at Tljuma, Buzzard Mountain, in these pristine summit South grasslands, and at Interveni Forest, where it's a huge area of afforestation. And basically this shows the result I've just shown you. The pie chart was at Newgate Farm with the majority of Artemis auratus. There was also a historical record from Interveni. So our records showed, from Newgate Farm and from these top, some of Southveld, we only catch the Angoni flaret now, but we still catch the auratus at Interveni Forest, which was previously open grasslands, now afforested. So what on earth is going on? Why has the grassland species become extinct, or possibly we hypothesize becoming extinct in the western central Zoutpansberg? Is it just bush encroachment? I don't think so, because these seemingly pristine habitats in the summit Vlauwveld now house just the savanna species. We no longer get the grassland species in the true grassland. So it could be rainfall. If anybody knows the Zoutpansberg, it has a huge east-west rainfall gradient from 700 meters at Tljuma in the west to 2 meters at Interveni Forest, with an extra meter of mist precipitation. So we know both the species from the accent models respond to rainfall, though. So why would it favor one species, not the other? And this gradient has existed for more than 100 years. The projections for the next 2050 are very similar. So it doesn't seem to be rainfall per se. My theory is that hydrology must be playing an important part with this afforestation, drier soils, more open vegetation, Not just that, but abstraction for irrigation, the macadamia industry, in the Lavuvu Valley. So that could, and what Davis showed us about how these two species segregate at the microhabitat level. We also know something about temperature change. We've got 2 minutes to go. Temperature change over the last 50 years. The stars represent those 4 sites that we sampled from west to east on the Soutpansberg. And so the red shows areas that have increased by more than 0.1 a decade or half a degree in those catchments in the last, since 1950 to 2000. The green areas where the 2 sites on the center and east are the Lavubu catchment, Gelede catchment. They haven't changed much in climate change, in temperature. So basically, my conclusions are that having these matched historical and botanical records and archives, repeat collections and photographs are very, very important, but we still find a whole number of drivers that are often correlated to each other. That makes it really difficult to still tease apart how important bush encroachment per se has been on species composition changes in mammals. But my hypothesis that I would love to test more from botanical data, remote sensing data, from physiological experiments, is that it's not so much the bush encroachment per se, but a combination of having this wetter, lusher climate at Indabeni, where the higher rainfall of wet soils, even in their forested environment, they can find habitat to persist, and possibly together with the less intense change in temperature, to enable the grassland species to hang on in the relic population, but not in the east. So thanks. I think I kept to time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. I think you even caught up time. Any questions for Peter?
I would love it if you came and did some of that work in Cathedral Peak as well. And yeah, some of our other long-term sites.
Just, I was wondering sorry, I missed a lot of the talk, but predator avoidance behavior in rodents and avoidance of hitting other individuals of the same kind. Surely that would change dramatically once you go from a grassy environment to a forested, bushy one.
You might have missed the slide where I showed the color differences, and that's the hypothesis, is that the savanna species is a paler color. It's more matched to the open ground, probably for predator avoidance, whereas the other species really needs dense cover. So I think it's a major factor that the vegetation structure favors the species that's more cryptic, can avoid predation. So I think it's going to be a really important factor. See one more?
Just thinking back to William's gap story and the ecology of some of these rodents, I was also thinking about mole rats. Do you think it's possible that they could possibly create these rooting gaps in our grasslands?
Definitely, I would say mole rats. I never thought of that when I was listening to the talk, but yeah, they have extensive burrow systems that they use that could very well. And they are known to be soil engineers, so this is something that I hadn't thought about. It would be great to. That's why it's good for botanists and zoologists to talk together sometimes. Thanks.
Cool. No more. Thank you, Peter. Okay, we now have 2 talks on legislation, and the first one, I think we're very lucky to have Professor Brian van Wilken here to talk about the legislation governing invasive alien plants in South Africa. So, Brian, thanks. Middle one's a point. No, I've never pressed that. That's the one on the other side.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Grant and Ralph, for inviting me here. I enjoyed the drive up here like William did. The only thing that I didn't like was driving through the Cape Fold Mountains and seeing all the damn pine trees going up the mountain, and all the rest of them. I must say I'm not a lawyer. I'm a retreaded forester. I was asked to speak about legislation, and I told Grant that I know nothing about legislation and bush encroachment. I do know a little bit about the alien plant legislation, so that's what I'm going to be talking about now. And hopefully you'll fill in the rest of it later. So why should we worry about this? This is a photograph I took of the catchment of the Tewater's Cliff Dam. It's the biggest dam feeding Cape Town's water supply. This is not a plantation. This is pine trees going up the slope that have just spread there with their winged seeds, and they've just about replaced everything else there. So this is an enormous problem, and it's going to get worse because pine trees are able to spread with winged seeds, so they can blow around everywhere, and you see them appearing on the tops of mountains and all the way up the slope. I think it's important to, when we talk about legislation, to just be clear about what we mean when we talk about policy and strategy and legislation and regulations. So policy is a set of principles and objectives and guidelines that a government puts out there to articulate their vision. A strategy is a detailed plan of action about how you're going to achieve that vision, and what resources and steps you need. And then laws are just final, formal, binding rules that say how you must behave. And regulations are rules and directives in terms of those laws. When we produced this book, was published in 2020, I can't believe it, 4 years ago already. There's a chapter in there by Peter Lukey and Jenny Hall. Peter Lukey is a policy expert in the Department of Environment Affairs, and Jenny Hall is a lawyer at University of Johannesburg. And they did a chapter in there on biological invasion policy and legislation development in South Africa. The bottom line is that we don't have a policy in this country. The government does not have a policy on how we should deal with invasive species. When I speak to we put this in the last status report that there is no policy, and they came to argue with us. They said, of course we've got a policy. Look at all the laws we've got. And we told them, it's different. The laws are not a policy. There is no government policy. So there's a list in this chapter of all of the questions that we can't answer because we don't have a policy. So this is not all of them, this is just a few of them. So, for example, how do we decide what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in terms of invasive species? What would we regard as acceptable change in the land and the landscape brought about by invasions? Should we be sacrificing some landscapes to invasive species and so on? There's no policy on any of this. And so there are some things that come to the fore which we can't answer because there is no policy. And the issue of trout is a good example. Trout were introduced about 150 years ago to provide angling opportunities. And the government tried to list trout as an invasive species, and this angered the fishing fraternity, the trout angling fraternity. It's almost like a religion to them. They tie these little flies and they, do their thing. And there's even a book written about this. Are trout South African? The argument is that they've been here long enough. They've been here for over 100 years. They don't do any harm, which is nonsense. They do. But that's a point of view. And the amount of energy that went into managing just this one question about this species was enormous. Likewise, on Table Mountain, when the national park started clearing some of the pine plantations out of what became Table Mountain National Park, there was enormous kickbacks from the public in Cape Town. Then when it comes to strategy, I was at the CSR, this was now 10 years ago, this thing's dated 2014. We were hired to produce a national strategy on invasive species in South Africa, or on biological invasions and how they should be managed. This document was worked on by, I don't know, at least 20 or 25 different scientists put this together. We delivered it it's even on my birthday, the 25th of March 2014, to the government. There it lay on the shelf. It hasn't been used, it hasn't been adopted. There were things in it they didn't like, and it has never been adopted. At the moment, I was asked to attend a workshop in July 2021, where the government is now working on their own National Invasive Species Strategy and Action Plan. This was the fourth draft that we were given in 2021 to look at. It still hasn't been finalized. There's no sense of urgency around trying to get this thing out. When it does get finalized, it goes out then for public comment. And so it's still going to be another couple of years at least before we have a strategy to put into action the policy which doesn't exist. But we've got plenty of laws. Lots and lots of laws, starting in 1861 with the Xanthium spinosum Act. And this comes out of Lucian Hall's chapter. There's been an almost continuous process of lawmaking over 160 years, with 50 pieces of legislation passed since that Xanthium spinosum Act in 1861. And all of them follow this concept of faultless liability. So what that says is, if you're a landowner or you're a manager of a piece of land, and there's an invasive species on that land, then you are liable to manage it. You're not responsible for bringing it there in the first place. So, for example, if you have a farm and your neighbor plants an invasive species on his farm, and that species invades your farm, you are responsible for managing it, and it's not your fault. That's a faultless liability. This might well be challenged in court one day. We'll come back to that. So here's the current set of laws that actually influence the management of biological invasions: Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act, the Biodiversity Act, the Protected Areas Act, the Fire Act, Heritage Act, Forest Act, and the Mountain Catchment Act. So there's a lot of current law that affects how you deal with invasive species. The Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act was the first one that was available when we started the Working for Water program in 1995. So in 1984, this act listed, I think it was about 70 species that had to be managed, and these included some woody species, acacias, leptospermums, parasyrianthes, and so on. The acacias were Australian, William, but not the commercial ones. No species of commercial value. But then in 2001, the list was expanded to include species that were commercially valuable, like wattles, pines, eucalypts, and poplars were all listed as species, as invasive species. And there were three categories. Category one is a weed. Everybody agrees it's a weed. It has to be managed. Category two are weeds that also have commercial value. So you can get a permit to grow those and trade in them. And then three was recognized weeds that have ornamental but no commercial value. For example, jacaranda trees in Pretoria. The National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, NEMBA, was then promulgated in 2004. And the NEMBA Act, when it was promulgated in 2004, the Act said that the government will produce a list within 2 years of promulgation, in other words, by 2006. And this list was then to essentially replace the Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act lists. And under NEMBA, you have category 1, which is the old weeds from the Kara Act. Everybody agrees that they're weeds, they must be controlled, and they're not allowed to be cultivated or traded. And there's the important thing, category 2s are also category 1s unless you have a permit. So if you want to grow a tree that's listed as an invasive species in category 2, you can get a permit to grow it, but that permit will have certain conditions attached to it. So here's a timeline. This is a paper that was published this year by John Wilson and Sabrina Kumshik, which shows you that in 2004, the NEMBA Act, does this thing have a pointer? Oh, it's that dangerous one that doesn't go away. 2004, the NEMBA Act was published, and then there was a series of very badly managed attempts at drawing up a list of species. Eventually, the Kloof Conservancy in KwaZulu-Natal took the department to court and made them publish a list, which they then published 10 years after they were supposed to have done so. And those lists have then been revised a few times recently, and also Barbara Creasy removed trout from the list. She just wasn't prepared to deal with all the flack that was coming from the trout people. And here's an example of how these regulations are constructed. This is for pine trees, my favorite invasive species. So there's 111 species of pinus, are there? There's how many in South Africa? About 60 or 70 that have been. 86 have been introduced to South Africa. Only 8 of them are listed in the regulations, and they listed as category 2. But now, if you read the next thing, it says that all pines not in plantations and windrows with a circumference greater than 1.256 meters at a height of 1 meter in 2014, in other words, the date that the regulations were published, are not listed. In other words, bigger trees are not listed in urban areas in Cape Town, the Overberg District Municipality, the Wynlands District Municipality, except when they are in a riparian zone or in a protected area or in a property directly abutting on a protected area, or where they pose a wildfire risk, where they remain as category 1. So what this says is that municipalities in the Western Cape were not obliged to go to people and say, you have to cut down that big pine tree in your back garden, or you have to cut down that pine tree in the local park. It would just be too unpopular. But if you had a small tree that was smaller than those dimensions, then you had to remove it before it got big. Now, I don't know that the municipalities have ever tried to enforce that, make people take out small pine trees. And in fact, Guy Preston came to me about a year ago and he said, can I please tell him what size would a pine tree be today that was that size in 2014, so that he can go back and say, you should have cut it down. So I said to him, Guy, it depends on what sort of soil it was growing on, whether you watered it or not, all kinds of things anyway. He's a very persistent man. The other thing is that the Minister of Forestry has exempted all forestry plantations that were established before 2014, in other words, before the NEMBA Act came into being. She exempted them from obtaining a permit. It was just going to be too difficult to try and deal with that. So there's a substantial area of commercial forestry that remains as an unregulated source of seeds. It's most of the plantations were established before 2014 anyway. In cases where commercial operators are required to have permits, in other words, new plantations, it's going to be very difficult to prove that those invasive pines over there came from that particular plantation. So you have this situation now where you have nice orderly plantations in the background, and spreading from those plantations up the mountain slopes are pine trees that originated in the plantations. The owner of those slopes is faultlessly liable, not the forestry company that planted them there in the first place. In most cases, that was the government anyway. Then there's this interesting definition in the Biodiversity Act and the Alien and Invasive Species lists. That's the regulations in terms of the Act, which defines a dormant plantation as a plantation that has not been operational or functioning for a period of 10 years. And it defines it in the regulations, but it never uses it. It doesn't say what you're supposed to do with dormant plantations. And I think that the intention there was that to be able to go to these abandoned plantations and say, this is no longer a plantation, it's no longer exempted, and it now because trees in that plantation now become category 1 and you have to remove them. But it hasn't happened yet. I think that's why it's there. Then you have the Protected Areas Act. The Protected Areas Act says that every protected area has to have a management plan. Now, all protected areas do have management plans, and they do, in those management plans, by and large, they do address invasive alien species. But the management plans are at such a high level that where it deals with alien species, it kind of just says, these are the species we've got and we're going to manage them. It doesn't say how. And the new draft of NEMBA, which is out for comment right now, says that the management authority of a protected area has to address biological invasions in their management plans, which they do anyway. It's just going to become more, but it doesn't specify the criteria for what constitutes an acceptable plan or not. Then you have the National Veld and Forest Fire Act, and quite often when you're managing invasive species, particularly in fire-prone environments, you have to integrate the management of those species with the prescribed burning fire regime as well, because they have to be treated in a certain way before you burn. And the Fire Act says up front, the purpose of this act is to prevent and combat mountain and forest fires. It doesn't say anything about it. It's there to facilitate the management of fires. Its main purpose is to combat them. But it does say that all owners of state must join the Fire Protection Association, and the Fire Protection Association must make rules which bind all of its members, and the rules which bind the members must provide for controlled burning to conserve ecosystems and to reduce fire danger. And that must is an important word, because if the law says you must do it, then you must do it. Some phrases it says you can do that or you may do it, but if you must do it, you have to do it. So basically, this act says you have to come up with a burning regime that will conserve the environment, which would include managing invasive alien species. However, that doesn't happen very often. This is that's where I live, in Betty's Bay. We wanted this piece of felt to be burnt. It hadn't burnt for 26 years. It was due for a fire. The proteas were starting to senesce in there. It took us 2.5 years to get this prescribed burn done. And on the day that it was done, we had 3 helicopters on standby. We had about police and forestry vehicles, volunteer vehicles. There must have been about 30 vehicles scattered around. There was about 100 people involved in actually burning that fire. An enormous amount of effort, because they were so scared that if that fire got out of hand, they would be held liable. And the net result now is that almost all fires, at least in the fynbos biome, are unplanned fires. They're not prescribed burns at all anymore. And this just exacerbates the invasion problem. I mean, back William, in the old days when we were in forestry, we would have done that fire with 2 buckies and 2 foremen and 10 laborers. I promise you, it was anyway. Then there's the Mountain Catchment Areas Act, which says that it was promulgated in 1970, that the minister may define an area that is a mountain catchment area. And that act then allows for what they call the destruction of vegetation, which is, in the opinion of the minister, intruding vegetation. That was the language they used, but they mean invading alien plants. And the important thing here is that this act applies to any mountain catchment area and also to a distance of 5 kilometers from the boundary of that mountain catchment area. If you can see here, this is the only map I could find, but the shading here shows proclaimed. So the only proclaimed mountain catchment areas are in the Western Cape. But the government is allowed, using this act, to go 5 kilometers from the boundary and say, and clear vegetation from those areas. This act is hardly used at all. Then there's the National Heritage Resources Act, which proclaims some species as heritage trees. So, for example, the stone pines on Table Mountain, you require an extra permit to remove them from the protected area. And then we have the Forest Act, which then included regulations around what they call champion trees. This is tree huggers who want to protect individual trees, and on the basis of their size, age, or historical value. So you have the bizarre situation where you've got Pinus halepensis, which is a category 1 species. It's a weed. Everybody agrees it's a weed. It has to be removed. But this particular one in the Ardennes Gardens in Claremont is protected. You may not cut it down without a permit. Pinus radiata, there's one particular Pinus radiata in Asadingi State Forest in the Eastern Cape, which is a NEMBA category 2. There's Sequoia sempervirens, which is that's the coastal redwood, isn't it? Yeah, the tall one. In Table Mountain National Park, it's not a listed species, but it's protected, and so on. So you have these complications coming up. And here's one example. This is a Eucalyptus camaldulensis tree outside of Wilgenhof. I'm not taking any questions on Wilgenhof. It wasn't named after me. Known as the Wilgenhof grandfather. That particular tree, that individual is protected. It's a champion tree, and it's also a very, very aggressive invader of riparian zones. And so the NEMBA category for this species is what they call context specific. It depends on where it is in the landscape, in which way it is regulated. So this is what the regulation says about camaldulensis, just to show you how they've tried to bend over to accommodate everybody here. So it's a category 1 if it's in a riparian zone or in a protected area or a listed ecosystem. But it's not listed in the Lama Karoo, the succulent Karoo, the desert biome, unless it's in a protected area or a riparian area. And then it's category 1 in fynbos, grassland, savanna, Albany thicket, and so on. And it's category 2 if it's a plantation or woodlot or a bee forage area or windrow or a lining of avenues. It's not listed if it's in cultivated land that is at least 50 meters away from untransformed land, but excluding any area in A above. And then it's not listed within 50 meters of the main house of a farm, but excluding those in A above, and not listed in urban areas when it's tiny at the date of 2014. So no wonder people are confused. It really is difficult to follow. So that one is okay because it's standing in a field more than 50 meters away from transformed land, but it's not okay if it's growing along a river. And then I've covered all the laws there. So we've got some issues if you want to discuss them. The one is around capacity to enforce these regulations. I think the department has got, I think it's 2 or 3 people covering the whole country. That their responsibility is to go and check up on every landowner and every land manager and see that they're managing each of these species that occur on their land. It's really very thin on the ground. There's the issue of faultless liabilities. If some clever guy gets taken to court and has got the time and the money, they're going to challenge this. And the legal people tell me it's probably not going to get past the Constitutional Court. And then there's the issue of funding. There's an enormous amount of money we're going to need if we're going to get on top of the invasion problem in most of the areas where we have to do so. So what you see here, this is the amount of money that was given by the Working for Water program per year to the protected areas in the Cape Floristic region. And I've inflated those figures to 2022 rand, so this inflation is taken into account. So you see it fluctuates a lot, it goes up and down. But this graph here shows how much was given to Cape Nature, which is the provincial conservation agency, and this is the amount that was given to South African national parks. And what you see here is that South African National Parks has got more or less sustained funding for their national parks. That's Table Mountain, Agulhas, West Coast, Bontebok, and Garden Route. Cape Nature, which manages the rest of the mountains in the Western Cape, has got a much larger area to manage, but they're not getting money. And in some years, they're getting no money at all. And I know that 23 and 24, they've also got zero money to manage the invasions. And the reason, one of the main reasons for this is that Cape Nature has to tender to get that money from Working for Water. Sandparks doesn't have to tender because Sandparks is an entity of the Department of Environment Affairs, so they can simply give them the money. And so it's easier for them to spend the money if they just give it to national parks. So this is an issue that we should discuss as well. But I don't know, I'm going to stop there, Grant. And,
Thank you.
so, this is a workshop. We should workshop and not have one person talking.
Yeah,
We've got
our interest. Yeah. Thank you, Brian. A little bit over, but still time for questions. I mean, I also think a lot of these questions will be quite long-winded and might be for this afternoon. So if you've got a question that I think warrants further discussion, can we hold it for this afternoon? But if it's for now, we can take it. Right.
Cool. Well, I'd be keen to hear it, so yeah, just can do it later.
I'm just going to ask a quick one. Have you looked at the recent proposed amendments to the National Water Act?
No.
Okay, we'll discuss it this afternoon.
Okay.
There's some nice clauses in there.
Good.
Thanks, Brian, for the insightful talk. I'm Claude Mshobani. I work for the South African National Biodiversity Institute. My question, I've got actually 2 questions. The first question relates to the several points that you made about lamenting about the poor quality of the work that was done in relation to putting together the list of alien and invasive species. My question is, what would you advise the government, or what should the government do in order to make sure that they've got nearly a perfect list? Because my question stems from the fact that some of the people that have been publicly criticizing the list, in the paper that we did trying to find out how the list was developed, we actually find that some of the prominent names were actually involved in drafting that very list, that some of them come publicly to criticize. Even some of the comments that we're making, for example, in relation to forestry, this rich history in terms of why they were made like that, and prominent names were actually involved in drafting this list. When it relates to compliance, the other companies, which I may not mention the names, which are popular plant production companies, were actually part of those who involved in the list. But when you go out in the field, you find that they are the very same ones, that they are violating the very same list or regulations that they've actually proposed. That is the first part of the question. I don't know if maybe I need to go to the second part.
Well, can I answer the first one? The issue is that the list that was finally drawn up after I think it was 2014, was it? The first list. It was the product of like you say, a workshop which involved a lot of people and a lot of specific people from specific disciplines. So you had plant experts and bird experts and so on, and the list was drawn up. And it can be criticized, it can be questioned. And when it gets questioned, if people come to the department and they say, why is this particular species on the list? The department is unable to answer because it hasn't been a proper risk assessment done yet. And that's what John Wilson and Sabrina's recent paper was about, is that they've established this committee now called the Alien Species Risk Assessment Review Panel, and they are working back through that list of listed species and trying to get the risk assessments done so that there's a scientific backing to having that species listed. And they went, I think it was Sanby, went to the department and they said to the department, tell us which species you want us to do first, because it's quite a process to do, to work through. I think there are 500 and something species on the list. And the department actually gave Sanby a list, most of which were extralimital game animals, because that's where the department is getting most of its requests for permits, is from game farmers who want to keep sitatungas in the fynbos, or lechwis in the karoo and all this kind of thing. So there's a process in place that's working through the list, doing all these risk assessments, so that the department will then be able to answer questions about why is the species on the list or not. I don't know if that answers your question.
Partially, because I'm in possession of all organizations that were involved, even specific names of people who were involved in drafting that list. But that is not the subject of what I'm talking about. What I'm want to take further that issue is that they, for example, the species that were listed, mainly the plants, there was a risk assessment that was conducted for all the plants that were listed. The risk assessment was developed by Leslie Henderson. But for the other species, for the other taxonomic groups, it was expert workshops. A few, actually a risk protocol was done. And also the NEMBA has what they call a risk assessment, which the authors that you mentioned, they were actually in opposition of that particular framework that is contained in NEMBA. Hence, they proposed the other, what they are now calling the risk analysis. The graph that you are showing there, in terms of what I think it's Wilson and Sabrina, the graph that he showed. Actually, that graph was part of the paper that I actually spoke about that we wrote. They were actually part of the very same paper that I'm referring to.
So what's your question?
My question is, there were risk analysis risk assessment that were done when the species were listed, but there's a public notion that there was no risk assessment that was done. And I'm in possession of those risk assessments that were done for the species that were listed. Hence, I'm saying the very same scholars that you are referring to were part of this initiative, were part of this paper in the first place. So there were risk assessments that were done. The risk assessment framework that was used was developed by Leslie Henderson, who was also part of this very same paper.
Okay, I don't know if we want to belabor this anymore, but I think currently there are not formal accepted risk assessments for most of the species on the list. So SANBI is working back through that list, and they are preparing proper acceptable risk assessments for all of the species on the list. But as we stand here today, I don't think that they are even more than 100 that have been done out of the 500. But maybe we can talk offline to see where we're not understanding each other here.
Okay. The second question is, you mentioned that there's two people or three. There's 2 people or 3 people that are responsible for inspecting the compliance. I'm not sure if you refer to the 2 to the biodiversity officers that are based in Cape Town, but what I know is that they also have individual representatives in provinces, and I think in Limpopo we have 2 that are the ones that are conducting these inspections in connection with the other guys that are based at the national office. So unless if maybe they are using other people from other sections to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I just know, and I've been speaking to people like Stian Kotze. He's in Cape Town, and there are a few others. But they tell me that there's very few. The number is less than 10. You know, it's 2 or 3 or 4, somewhere there. That their job description is to go out and do inspections and issue directives and all that kind of thing. But whatever, even if it's 2 per province or whatever, it's still very few people for the size of the job. The size of the job is enormous. You know, the number of land parcels, individual land parcels in the country is hundreds of thousands. And every one of them's probably got some invasive species on them. So it's an enormous job, and the department doesn't have the capacity to actually enforce these regulations. That's why you see municipalities, whatever, people have got these plants on their property. They're just doing nothing about it. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. So I got the honor of introducing the next speaker too. It's quite. I've got to get my mind around this quickly. It's either a horrible indictment on Brian or a glowing response for me. Brian is in Cape Town and I've been sitting in Clarence, but I'm about to present a talk which, slide for slide, is very similar to Brian's. To some points where Brian's reviewed some papers for me and theses for me, and he's written back his slide that I pitched up here. There is no policy, these are X, Y, and Z. And they appear in my talk. So a lot of what Brian has presented, you're going to see again here. I was quite amazed sitting there to see it. I did not plagiarize his talk, is what I'm trying to suggest. But it does make sense, because I'm talking about the policy and legislation that governs bush encroachment. Initially, we tried to get Brian to do this talk, and he said, no, I know enough about invasive species to do alien invasives. And then Ralph refused to do it, so I'm doing it. So it doesn't mean I'm an expert. Brian said he's not a lawyer. I'm not Brian, and I'm also not a lawyer. And so I've based a lot of this information on, firstly, this bit of policy. Not policy, it doesn't exist. But a lot of authors worked on this bit of work, which is towards a policy of indigenous bush encroachment in South Africa. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this and what's governing bush encroachment, where we'd like to go with bush encroachment, is to have a look at this piece of work. I find it very comprehensive, very nice to read, very easy to read, easy to understand. My only concern is that it was, I think, 2016, and it doesn't seem to be that anything has happened since then. As Brian mentioned, there's also this chapter 18 in his big tome here that's about biological invasions done by Lukey and Hall. Brian has the honor of knowing them in person. I know them as a paper. And again, if you're interested in the legislation and policy, it's really worth going to look at this chapter. Again, it's quite easy to understand. It's really well written and really gives a nice summary of how we got to this position where we are in South Africa, where there seems to be no policy, no legislation, and a lot of acts that sort of govern things and sort of don't, especially when it comes to bush encroachment. So, I mean, word for word, Brian's slide. And the highlight again is there's no policy, strategy, or legislation that deals with, Brian had invasive alien plants, but it applies to bush encroachment too in South Africa. And as he went through, we're missing the top three, but we do have regulations as in acts, and these are, Brian covered them, and they'll come up again, and I'll, in sake of time and just not to bore everyone, I won't go through them. He mentioned this, the regulations regarding mountains and mountain areas, and Kim and I wrote a paper about mountains, and in the paper we tried to discuss why there was so little legislation protecting mountains, and we discussed this the Mountain Catchment Areas Act, and we concluded it's probably because of the small area, but the low political power that people living in mountains have in South Africa. They're not. There's just not enough clout in them to warrant too much to protect them. But saying that, increasingly there's this notion of the importance of them for water. Well, not increasingly, it's been going for a while, and therefore they're getting protected more. And the first one that came out was this Mountain Catchment Area Act. Brian, different to me, highlighted that they were meaning invasives, but I think when we talk about bush encroachment, that's not invasives, and the Act definitely doesn't say invasive alien plants, as he mentioned. It's any plants that the minister deems that is intruding vegetation. So that definitely includes, in my perspective of reading this, it could be bush encroaching species. Who has the power to govern that act? They very much used to be in Department of Forestry, and they handed that out to, they call it provincial authorities. Those provincial authorities, it seems like, could be anyone in agriculture or environmental affairs, but you still have to get permission from the minister, and I think there's a breakdown there that could potentially happen. There's no mention of any specific species, alien or native, within that, so you can't say this is. You're going to have to motivate if you would like to use this act to manage bush encroaching species. But also, as Brian mentioned, that this act doesn't really seem to be used or implemented in South Africa. It sort of got surpassed by the CARA Act. But there is a very interesting, it's sort of cut off half my slide at the bottom there, but this paper, the Mountain Catchment Areas Act and its implementation is in, can you read it there for me? It's SA Law Journal or something at the bottom. Right. So it's a nice paper that goes through the Act and all its limitations and legally pulls out the limitations of it. One of the things it does bring out, as Brian said, is the definition of mountain area. So it's very difficult. You would have to motivate, if you want to use this Act, what you deem if it's a mountain area or not. But as Brian also mentioned, it got replaced by CARA. And CARA, out of all the legislation that I've had a look at while trying to develop this talk, is the only one that specifically mentions bush encroaching species as a negative aspect that need to be managed. And it's people who work with bush encroachment, this probably is common sense to you, but invasive aliens, and so it was new to me, and I found it interesting to find. And so they mention indigenous plants are regarded as indicators of plants indicating bush encroachment. They talk about land user of an area in which encroachment occurs. If those species that they've indigenous plants occur, the Act expects you to take steps to protect the resources, the environmental resources that are there, and they suggest the management strategies you should implement in this scenario. and they have provided a list of native species that they regard as bush encroaching species. As Brian said, it first came out in 1984, but they did redo it and added a whole bunch of species in 2001. Those didn't really include updates to the native species. But so here's the list of native species, a lot of acacia species. Leucocidia sericea is on this list. And then it says what province you need to be in for it to be regarded as an invasive species, which doesn't make sense to me. Again, people who work in this field might know better. To me, it should be based on more environmental parameters in provincial parameters. And as I mentioned, when they updated it, so these lists were developed in '84, and when they updated it in 2001, it was mainly the invasive alien plants section that got updated. So the title of my talk and what Ralph wanted me to discuss was how we go about changing the CAR regulations. If you have a native species that you want to appear on this list, how would you go about it? And this is, as far as I could understand, there isn't any specifics within the CAR regulations that say you follow these steps, but there are standard regulations on how you go about changing legislation or acts. For example, I go through this sequence of events where I work on biocontrol agents, and if we want to introduce a biocontrol agent, we have to change an act, and we follow these steps. So each one you can find out more information about them, but they're pretty self-explanatory. You've got to have your species you want to work with or get permission to control, or in my case, introduce. You've got to be clear on where you need to change the act. So in this example, you'd be wanting to add to this list. And then you've got to create a proposal, an amendment proposal. And this needs to be highly scientifically supported. Government likes science-based research. And so you're going to have to provide a lot of research on why this is a problematic species. And often that doesn't exist for a lot of the native species. So there's a bit of a breakdown there. So you need to provide a strong scientific motivation on why the species is becoming a problem. You then send that out for consultation. It says public. Within what we work, we would send it out for other peer review, scientific consultation. That will come back. You can amend your report based on all of that information. And then you would send it to government for approval. This will go all the way up to the minister. The minister will have to sign off and give permission. Just about always within the fields I work on, the minister isn't fair enough to, or know enough to be able to say yes or no. And she will send it out for review. She'll usually send it out for 2 local, 1 international, or international local review to scientists in the field to say, this scientific report this guy's presented, is it structurally sound? Are the methods sound? Are the conclusions sound? And if those come back positive, she's going to sign it into the act. If not, she will send it back and say, no, you need additional research. I need more information. I cannot make a decision with what you've provided. And you go back to whatever step she suggests or he suggests you need to go back to. Saying that, there's some points to consider. If we're talking about CARA, which is the only one that currently lists native invasive species, as I said initially, that's, as far as I can understand, the best way to go about it, but the CARA doesn't say we have a specific set of rules you must follow to change it. I mentioned the provincial boundaries, and there's no mention of mountains in there. I think that it should be more based on environmental things, but in your motivation, based on the current setup, you're going to have to motivate what province you want to conduct the species to be added to the list. But here's a big one for me. It hasn't been updated since 2001. No species have been added since 2001, and those were invasive species, so 1984. So it doesn't seem, in my opinion, that this is an act that's a living document. There's no be adding species. And so if you do follow those procedures, there's no guarantee you're going to get a species added onto the list. And then also, as Brian mentioned, it still stands, but it's been replaced by NEMA and NIMBA regulations that came out. But also, as Brian very accurately pointed out, those are more focused on invasive alien plants, and there's very limited direct mention of bush encroaching species within those. It's the same table Brian had. These are the lists of regulations that we have, acts in South Africa that govern invasive alien plants, but they mention the protection of the environment or protection of areas, and therefore bush encroachment would fall into those categories. And so I'm not okay, Brian elaborated, you've just seen that. So these are the limitations where I feel bush encroachments aren't represented in the NEMBA Acts. There's no list. So there's no list there that says, like in the CARA list, that says these ones are we regard as bush encroaching species. So you're going to have to motivate to a point, and I don't really see how it fits in. You're not going to be able to add a species to a list that doesn't exist. And we've just been having a back and forth about the risk assessments. There were these old risk assessments, but currently for invasive alien plants, there's a risk assessment done on your species. It's very clear the steps you take to conduct these risk assessments, and those risk assessments very much govern the species that appear on the lists. Those are not available for native species, so I suppose you could put a native species through the risk assessment, but you're going to have to change the whole process of the risk assessment to get something to happen there. And from what I can see, the NEMBA, NEMA, the Forestry Acts, they primarily use bush encroachment to protect native species. I think I've got a picture of it there. So this is an example. This is in the fynbos biome, and some guys there used that a chunk. They said there was bush encroaching on a big piece of fynbos, and they cleared it with a bulldozer. And so these acts are more to protect, to say, no, this, you need really good information and research to show that your invasive native species of bush encroacher is causing damage to get permission, and there's to protect the land. Where I think Ralph and us, looking at it from a scenario of Leucocidia sericea, we're saying it looks like an invasive alien plant. It's having negative impacts on the environment. We need an act to protect us from the bush encroacher. And so within the legislation, there's this ambiguity when it comes to NEMBA. It's like if your land is biologically important, if you want to use a bulldozer, X, Y, and Z, then you fall under NEMBA, not the other way around as it is with invasive plants. There's very much a transboundary issue for South Africa for both our provincial level legislation. As I mentioned, CARA is based on provinces, but a lot of our mountain systems are on our provincial boundaries, as well as a lot of our mountain systems are on our international boundaries. And while policy, strategy, legislation, regulations, whatever we talk, at whatever level, they are very much governed by political and provincial boundaries, but invasive plants aren't. Many of you will know the difference between Dominican Republic and Haiti, and that's the type of thing we can see. Ralph might share some examples of the conflicts, not conflicts, but the different worldviews Lesotho has with regard to bush encroachers to what South Africa has, both alien and native species. And next. This was also mentioned. So who is currently, and I asked Brian about this last night, I said, where does the Working for Water program, the Working for Ecosystems is the one I know of. I was going through there, I would call it their manifesto of what working on ecosystems does, because I know they are the guys who are actually clearing bush encroaching species in one or two mountain ranges in South Africa. And I don't fully understand what act they fall under. They sort of just seem to have a mandate. They can go to an area and say, this is bush encroachment, we're going to clear. But if you go through their manifesto of working on ecosystems, bush encroachment really doesn't appear strongly. It's more focused on soil erosion, sometimes, it's all about water conservation. So it's trying to protect ecosystems to get more water out. And so very little is mentioned in there regarding pure management of bush encroaching species. But I think it was Peter or somebody mentioned that there are examples. In the Eastern Free State, they're clearing Leucocidia sericea, and you can see hillsides cleared by working on ecosystems. But they seem to be the only people that are currently managing them. And in that Luke and Hall paper, they mentioned that's very dangerous for policy, because if there's only one group, it's only one person you have to manage. If there are lots of groups, then it forces you to develop policy to govern everyone into managing bush encroachment. So, I'm sad about that list. So my final considerations and conclusions is, as Brian has highlighted and I've highlighted again, we need to get to a point where we're developing policy and strategy, and it's interesting to say that we see that we are making progress and that there is some suggestions towards that. We need a lot more studies on bush encroachers, native bush encroachers. I work in the field of invasive aliens, and we do a lot of research and received a lot of funding to do a lot of research to show the impacts, to show the economic rewards of clearing, to show the social impacts of invasive plants. And those studies don't exist. And until we start building up data to support why native bush encroaching species are doing so much damage, we're going to struggle to get the regulations that we need to protect us from these species. As I said, there's no risk assessments available for native species. We need a proactive system towards this. We can't be reactive. And we're going to hear about the Range X program, and I think that's one of the first proactive steps that's been taken in South Africa to try and pick up some species that we don't know of yet that are going to become more invasive. There's a serious problem with complexes of species. The talk I was supposed to give this morning is about invasive rosaceae invading the eastern highlands of the Drakensberg. And those are native and invasive species together. So it's hard. You can't go in and clear just the aliens if there's native species that's going to replace them. So that needs to be clarified. And everything seems to ignore. I kept typing in search word herbicide, and it's ignored. And it's dangerous because there's no registered herbicides for just about all of our native species. So we're getting told we have to manage species, but good management often requires herbicide. And if there's no herbicide and you're going down, cutting down a thing that suckers, you're making the problem worse. So there has to be more discussion about herbicide. Apparently you can use a bulldozer, but you can't use herbicide, which to me is an interesting scenario. And that's all I have. Questions? Brian?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just two observations. The Mountain Catchment Areas Act was promulgated in 1970. That's over half a century ago. At the time it was promulgated, it was aimed at the Department of Forestry, which existed as a separate department in those days. The Department of Forestry was responsible for managing mountain catchment areas and owned a lot of mountain catchment areas. It doesn't anymore. Those now went to the provinces. But at the time, it had teams of people clearing invasive species.
From 70s.
Huh?
In the 70s.
Yes.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Through the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in what was then the Western Cape and Southern Cape forestry regions and Tsitsikamma forestry region. The idea of the 5-kilometer boundary was to empower those teams of people to clear invasive species beyond the boundaries of the mountain catchment area. In those days, they had a budget and so on. So the provision was that the minister could decide what intruding vegetation was. The intention was that it was aimed at invasive alien species. But you could use that legislation today. All it has to do is the minister has to say, I regard Leucocidia sericea as an intruding vegetation, and then they can pay for teams to go and clear it up to 5 kilometers. That's how you could interpret it.
Yeah.
except they've run out of money. So they don't have nearly the resources that they had back in 1970.
I don't think it
The-
sits
the-
with forestry anymore, though. I think they've handed
the minister is now the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment.
Yeah.
It's the same. That's what
Yeah,
that's what it would be. With regard to working for water and which legislation it operates under, it doesn't operate under it. Working for water doesn't own land. So what they do is they get money from the expanded public works program and they disperse it to landowners. And the landowners might be government, they might be private, they might be communal, but they are responsible for, you know,
If
in terms of
contravention of the law, yeah,
the law. And working for water's performance gets measured simply on whether they spend the money, whether they create jobs, and whether they provide development opportunities. They don't get measured at all on whether they're being successful in terms of clearing the invasives. That measurement gets done on the people they give the money to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just make a comment. I think the land tenure situation is something that affects both the invasive species and the bush encroachment, because it feels like we have very big worldview tensions within South Africa about land tenure and the responsibilities that come with it. So at the moment, the absolute liability is on a private landowner, assuming that private land ownership is the preferred worldview, because there's a financial ability, hypothetically, to address the invasive species on that land. And I say hypothetically because often the bush encroachment or the invasion exceeds the cost of addressing it would exceed the value of the land in many cases. But much of our land is state land, either under a state department like a protected area, or it's communal traditional authority land, which is also technically state land, but it doesn't have the same administrative structures necessarily for conservation or implementation like a protected area would have. So you have then a very small tax base in South Africa as well, where a small tax base is effectively responsible for their own property as well as for everyone else's property, because it's their taxes that are paying all the state programs to implement the natural resource management programs, etc. So I think there's a lot of worldview tension there that actually might be affecting how the fact we don't actually have a policy might also be because we don't really have a land tenure policy in the country. And if expropriation without compensation became a major factor in South Africa, that would compound it even more, because now you have less people who would be financially able to actually do anything on land that they no longer own or don't want to put the risk in. But we can discuss all of this in the policy and practice, but I just think the land tenure is probably as complicating as the legislation is unclear, and it probably comes down to a political ideology really at the end of the day.
yeah.
But we can start unpacking that, I think, later. So
Happy. Lunchtime. Oh, 9 minutes. I think we're done. I think I'd just like to thank everyone who was here, contributed, all the talkers for the sessions. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you did. And yeah, I think we can break for lunch.